Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say, and my name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at CIGI. Tonight is the latest in our regular series of public events, the CIGI Signature Lecture Series. I'd like to thank CIGI's public event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books. Thank you for your continuing support. Besides the audience here tonight at the CIGI Atrium, we also have a global audience who are watching through our live webcast available anywhere that has the internet. Following tonight's address, we welcome questions from the audience, either at the microphones here at CIGI or if you're watching online, you can ask questions through the live chat function on your screen, and we'll transmit those questions to our speaker. As well, CPAC is covering tonight's event. CPAC is the cable public affairs channel. Our topic tonight is politics and peace building, testing a new approach in Egypt. Our guest speaker is Ben Roswell, who will be introduced more properly in just a moment by CIGI Senior Fellow Mark Sedra. Mark is the leader of CIGI's project on security sector governance and also teaches in the Department of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. Mark's current research focuses on the topic of post-conflict state building with an emphasis on security issues. He's conducted research on a number of countries and regions, including Northern Ireland, Sudan, Afghanistan, the Balkans, and the Middle East, tonight's topic. So Mark, over to you.
Good evening. I'm going to keep this relatively brief so we can get straight to Ben and have plenty of time for questions afterwards. This is, as I'm sure you'll all agree, is an historic and defining period for the Arab world, and particularly for Egypt. Egypt is the beating heart of the Arab world, and the changes that Egypt is undergoing right now, and we're still in the early stages of its revolution, are quite astounding. And the reality is that no one could have predicted or has predicted what has happened in Tahrir Square. One of the most surprising and intriguing parts of this revolution is the role of social media in facilitating the uprising. It has caused many to think deeply about the role of technology, the internet, and social media in democracy promotion and peace building. One of those people who is thinking deeply about this subject is Ben Roswell, who's with us tonight. He is in the right place to do this thinking right now, as he's currently a visiting scholar at Stanford in the heart of Silicon Valley. And he has spent quite a bit of time not only thinking about Egypt and the ongoing Arab Spring, but also about the implications for technology and the role that technology has played. He put a book project on hold, I understand, to probably the detriment of the book overall, and probably his publisher are not happy, to inquire about this important issue when the first signs of revolution began to emerge in Egypt. And he quickly went to Egypt in the aftermath of the revolution to examine what exactly had happened there. This was, as some have called it, Revolution 2.0, a new type of revolution that has to be understood. He's also begun a project to mobilize Silicon Valley professionals to assist Egyptian democracy activists. Ben will be describing his work, this fascinating work, and its initial findings tonight. But before I ask him to come up on stage, maybe I'll just tell you a little bit more about him. Ben Roswell, is currently a visiting scholar at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. He is a Canadian diplomat on leave with a specialization in state building and stabilization. As representative of Canada in Kandahar from 2009 to 10, he directed the Kandahar Provincial Reconstruction Team, leading a team of more than 100 American and Canadian diplomats and workers, civilian police, and other experts in strengthening the provincial government at the heart of the Afghan conflict. Before that, he served as the deputy head of mission for Canada in Kabul for a year as well. And he's had a number of other postings over the years, including in Iraq, Egypt, Somalia, and others. He is one of our brightest and most distinguished diplomats, and an excellent researcher as well. And I should mention that he is here tonight as a disclaimer. He will be speaking as a researcher and will not be representing the Canadian government or speaking on behalf of the Canadian government. So it's with great pleasure that I can ask Ben to come to the stage and welcome him here to CIGI to give this talk.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Mark. It's great to be here at CIGI today. We had some very serious, somber discussions in the morning about Afghanistan, about Haiti. Discussions about peace building do tend towards the more severe. I plan tonight to offer a note of hope on a different country case in Egypt, which I think will be equally important for the future of international security. Now, Mark did mention that I am not speaking as a Canadian government official. I'm on leave right now. I will be drawing on some of my experience as a practitioner who has specialized in international security and governance over at least the last 10 years. Like a lot of people in my profession, the death recently of Osama bin Laden caused me to take a big step back and to think about some of the work that I've done over the last 10 years. It occurred to me that virtually every job that I've done over the last 10 years has been, in some sense, a response to an international security agenda established in large part by this one violent ideologue. And when you think about it, it's really quite extraordinary that one man with such violent extreme views, not shared by the vast majority of Muslims around the world, could have such a profound impact. How was he able to really shape the entire agenda of international security for at least a decade? And I think the answer lies in the deep wellspring of anger that had risen in countries with dysfunctional domestic politics. For decades, globalization has brought wrenching changes that has driven social and economic upheavals in countries around the world. In the countries that Osama bin Laden was targeting in particular, the Arab world, very few of those governments had a popular mandate, and that made them less resilient in the face of change. Without that relatively universal source of legitimacy, some of those countries were not able to respond to the demands for change through the peaceful political mechanisms. And so some of the forces for change turned to violence. Violence against their regimes, but violence also against the international system that some held to account for these wrenching changes. Now, I'm not saying any of this to absolve any foreign policy errors by governments that uphold the international system, governments like Canada or the United States, but just to point out that for at least a decade, if not more, the principal challenges that we're facing in international security arise from dysfunctional domestic politics in countries beyond our borders. As the world shrinks, as globalization brings us closer and closer, increasingly the problems in the domestic politics of other countries become our problems very quickly. You would hope that with these shared problems, we would also have some kind of shared solutions. We have innovated, I think, quite a lot over the last 10 years. Certainly in our bilateral efforts, there's been a huge increase in Canada's contributions to state building and to military operations in failed and fragile states. There's been some innovation in international organizations, which are the specialty of CIGI. But one thing that's always struck me as a practitioner is how few tools we actually have as governments to influence domestic politics in other countries. If there are some kind of blockage or dysfunctional politics that prevents that society from resolving differences among competing groups peacefully, what is there that Western or other governments can do about it? And it's always been surprising to me how few options we really have. I could think of 3 reasons for this. One is obviously the norm of sovereignty, which makes it inappropriate for countries to intervene in the affairs, the domestic affairs of other countries. The world is organized in a hierarchical fashion with these vertical barriers between us. So even if we have shared problems, we're not necessarily able to act in the political sphere of other countries. Fair enough. A second general restriction on the ability of governments to act elsewhere is that the institutions that work in one government in one country won't necessarily work in the other one. So often people have criticized democracy promotion for being this idea that perhaps we could just take the Canadian Constitution and transplant it in Morocco or Tunisia and have those problems be sorted out, and that clearly does not work. A third problem is that states, like the government of Canada, are states, and politics is increasingly a problem of the relationship between states and societies. So how do you mobilize the capacities of society to help with the domestic political problems in other countries? This is where I think there's some hope with the situation in Egypt. Completely unprompted by anyone outside of Egypt, we are now seeing, for the first time in over 30 years, dramatic political change in the domestic politics, not only of Egypt, but of many Arab countries. I think it's incumbent on us, even though we are only a few months into this revolution, to try and find out what is driving that change and to see if there's something that we might be able to do to contribute to a positive outcome for the democratic transition in Egypt. This is what brought me to Egypt in March and April. I do recognize that this is a very short amount of time in order to draw any conclusions. I also believe that there are others that are perhaps better placed to analyze Egyptian politics. I will point out Dr. Mohammed Al-Masri, who's an Egyptian Canadian here in Waterloo, who has just released a DVD, I believe, an eyewitness guide to the revolution, which I would encourage you to take a look for in the back. I think it's important, though, that we do take the risk of trying to identify what's happening early on, because the time is short. For the Egyptian democracy activists, they're facing a very tight timetable. In September, they will be electing a new parliament. That parliament will select people to negotiate a new constitution and will rewrite the rules of the political game in Egypt. All of this will happen in the next few months. And the feeling in Cairo is of a real sprint, as everyone is trying to prepare for the change that's underway. I think the time is also short for us, for the international community, if we want to make positive change. So what I will do for the rest of this presentation is to draw some early conclusions for what might be happening with the combination of technology and politics in Egypt, with a view to identifying what outsiders might be able to do. Now, there's many things that drive a revolution, like in Egypt. I was covering Egypt for the Canadian government in the 1990s, and I covered a lot of these issues. Social problems, economic problems, a very unstable region. Many of the issues that drove the revolution in 2011 were also there in 1996 to 98, which was when I was in Egypt. At least one major change is the role of technology. So in the course of my interviews with Egyptian democracy activists, I asked all of them, what was it about technology that allowed the revolution to succeed in this case? And I got three general sorts of answers. So, over the past 30 years, Egypt has operated under an emergency law, a law that has banned gatherings of more than 5 people. It was a way that the regime could prevent political activity. Over the last 10 years, the internet has grown massively in popularity. There's now 12 million Egyptians on the internet. And with that, social media tools like Facebook have also become incredibly popular. Now, as in Canada and other countries, in Egypt, Facebook is used for the most part to share family pictures and videos of cats doing funny things and to arrange dates and what have you. It is primarily social media. But when you get enough people who are able to communicate freely and openly, if they choose to start talking about politics, you all of a sudden have a very powerful political tool. So remember, the emergency law banned gatherings of more than 5 people at a time. If you look at this Facebook page up in the left-hand side, you'll see how many people participate in this discussion in Facebook. Almost 1.2 million people. This is a page about Egyptian politics. It's probably one of the most famous Facebook pages in Egypt. It's called We Are All Khaled Said, or Kullana Khaled Said, and it rose in July of 2010 in response to the murder, the death by police beating of a 27-year-old computer science engineer called Khaled Said, who was posting videos that implicated the police in a drug deal. He was arrested by the police and beaten to death in the alleyway beside the cyber cafe. The photo taken by his brother of his bloodied face was posted to the internet and went viral, and in response, a Google executive called Wael Ghanim created this Facebook page out of solidarity to say to the Egyptian people, we are all like Khaled Said, we are all potentially victims of this regime. And that caught like wildfire. There's a few things about Facebook that make it particularly useful as a political tool. One of them is that it is a social network. You are part of a network when you click on this page. When you join this page, you are a member. All of the content is co-created by the members. There's no hierarchy. There's no formal institution like a political party to which you're just a passive recipient of information. You're an active participant. It also is quite good at conveying emotional content, as you can see from the horrific pictures of Khaled Said's face, sometimes video as well. The kind of information that's conveyed to the member of the network here tends to be much more compelling than information that they would receive from other sources. So technology helped open new spaces for political activity in Egypt. A second element that technology brought into Egyptian politics that facilitated the rise of the democratic movement was that it brought in new actors into Egyptian politics. It lowered the cost of participation. Rather than explaining to you myself how this works, I'm going to have one of the Egyptian democracy activists that I met with you tell you about it. I have a very short video clip of a man named Abdullah Helmi of the Reform and Development Party, and he explains how this works.
It's very funny. About 2.5 years ago, we started a political party on Facebook. And people just looking at us and make fun of us, starting a political party on Facebook. Wow, like Noah, building a ship in the desert. So, and they are laughing about us. You will reach nothing by this. People will say yes on Facebook, but never show in reality. But having a human element, working with on Facebook, answering questions of the people, sending message and asking people to be engaged and inviting them, getting their phone numbers, putting his phone number online, receiving calls, and with importance and answer with importance several times, and then people get engaged, and we see downloaded persons from the internet cloud to reality. And you know, the best of the best people we got by this method. Downloaded leaders are now driving the movement further and further.
So as Abdullah says, by spreading the word through the internet, it made it a lot easier for people to participate in politics. And when you send out suggestions for how people can become active, if you're sending them to thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, you're going to start creating new activists. And the term that he uses, downloading activists from the internet. So new spaces, new actors. Technology also created new tactics. The second video is a little bit dark, I apologize for that. It's from the evening of the very first day of the revolution, from January 25th. It shows a protester being taken away by the police, a protester who's clearly not showing any threat, and getting beaten by the police. This was one of many videos recorded that day. This particular feed is from Sabah Hamamou, who was an activist that we met with. Now remember that Khaled Said was beaten to death by the police for posting videos that reflected badly on them. So imagine the courage that it took on the very first day of the revolution to take a video like this and to put it on YouTube. Well, Sabah Hamamou had that courage, and she immediately got 92,000 hits. It was videos like this that came out of what was happening in Tahrir, posted by people like her and others, some of whom actually pre-positioned cameras before the protests, knowing that the police would behave in this manner and wanting to tell the Egyptian people what was really happening in Tahrir Square. It was the cumulative effect of this use of new media which allowed the democracy movement to go above the heads of the regime and the propaganda tools that they had, the state-run media, and to tell their own story, their own narrative of what was really happening in Tahrir Square, and also in the process to tell the rest of the world. So new tactics also made possible by technology. Add all of these up together and you have a dramatic new outcome in Egyptian politics. This is the moment at which the resignation of President Mubarak was announced by then Vice President Omar Suleiman, which prompted an eruption of wild cheers, as you can imagine, in Tahrir Square, and Egypt began a fundamentally different era. Now, I've mentioned Facebook, I've mentioned YouTube. Satellite TV also was a technology that played a major role in the change of regime. But the conclusion that we came to in our results, the results of our research, was that there wasn't any one particular tool or technology that made the difference. There's no, in the language of the tech world, no killer app that can make a fundamental political change. Rather, there's a mindset that comes from the use of social media technology. Of course, the regime shut down the internet after only a few days into the revolution, thinking that if they didn't have access to YouTube or Facebook or what have you, that would disperse the crowds, but it did not do that at all. And that's because they weren't dependent on technology or on any specific tools. Remember that only 12 million Egyptians have the internet too, so there's also 70 million that don't. What seems to have been an even more dramatic change with the introduction of social media into Egyptian politics was a mindset, a way of collaborating, which seems to be different from the way that Egyptian politics is normally done. I call this a social media mindset, and I will explain in 3 sort of basic principles how it's different from what would have come before. Essentially, it's a mindset about mass collaboration, and that is the great potential of social media and Web 2.0 technologies, is the way that it allows thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to collaborate in a much easier way than was previously possible. So this social media mindset affects how people participate, the content of what they do, and they're engaged in politics, and the way that they communicate. The basis of participation is as individuals, as equal members of a network. You're not a member of Facebook as, a member of a certain social class, or as a member of a certain political party, or even a member of a certain tribe or ethnic group. You're there as an individual. There's an equalizing effect to social media, that everyone participates in this network on an equal basis as peers. Many people commented on the leaderless nature of the revolution in Egypt, that there was no clear hierarchy, and that's true, because it was organized on the basis of a network and not of a traditional hierarchical organization. That gives it a resilience and a strength that you don't see in other kinds of political movements. Secondly, there's a very strong sense of collective ownership. Like I said earlier with Facebook, where when you're a member of a particular group, you're co-producing the content of that group. You can put up content just like anyone else, and it's all shared among the members of the group. They bring the same mentality to politics. There's a real sense that this is something that's being done by the activists themselves. They're not trying to replicate or emulate any other political system. Remember in 1989, in the Tiananmen Square protests by Chinese students, that there was the goddess of democracy holding a lantern, reminiscent, of course, of the Statue of Liberty, where the message being that they wanted an American-style political system. There was nothing of the sort in Cairo. They were not trying to emulate Europe or the United States or Canada. They were very proud Egyptians trying to build a new political system to meet the needs of Egyptians. You saw Egyptian flags everywhere. This is not something I used to see in Egypt when I was living there in the 1990s. The Egyptian flag just didn't feature very prominently. Now everything is red, white, and black. You'd see people with their faces painted. There's a very strong sense that this belonged to Egypt. In fact, one of the most common things that we heard in our discussions with Egyptian democracy activists was about how this was their revolution, as if they owned this revolution. They don't want our revolution to be stolen from us. A very strong sense of collective ownership that I think is also characteristic of this social media mindset, where everyone is involved in the co-creation of content. And then finally, a real commitment to transparency and to documenting everything. You saw this video that Sabah Hamamou took of police brutality. That reflected this urge to get things up on the web so that people would know the truth. It's something that I found a bit surprising when we were doing our interviews. I asked everyone we met with, did you mind if we blog about you or tweet about you and use your name? And I expected that some people would be concerned about security. I mean, after all, it's still a military regime in Egypt. We don't know what the outcome of the revolution will be, and they could be engaging in some kind of risky behavior by talking to a Canadian based at an American university about democracy issues. Every single one that we met with. Not only did they give us permission, insisted that we use their names, insisted that we get their opinions out there, up on the web. It reminded me a little bit of how there's a generational divide in Canada. People of my generation, I'm in my early 40s, have some of their personal information up on the web. People of an older generation have relatively little on the web, and yet the younger generation, the digital natives, seem to not think twice about having vast amounts of personal information on the web. Their likes, their dislikes, where they're going, who they're dating, all kinds of things. It's like second nature for them to have their details shared publicly like that. Well, it's a bit like that with the youth activists in Egypt as well. The tendency is to be very open with information, to share it, and to get it out there so that people know where you stand. Where does that leave outsiders? Foreign governments played no role in the change of government in Egypt in February of 2011. This was entirely done by Egyptians themselves. So at first you might ask, well, why would there be any role for outsiders at all? As I mentioned earlier, the world has become such a small place that we are deeply involved in each other's domestic politics regardless. We don't really have a choice in the matter, and I believe that the outcome of the democratic transition in Egypt will be influenced in some shape, not only by domestic factors, but by international factors. The international factors may not be entirely either benign or malign. It can't be taken for granted that international influence would definitely assist in the democratic transition. And yet we have a lot at stake in the success of Egypt's democratic transition. And so I think it's incumbent on us as outsiders, for those of us that do support a democratic outcome for Egypt, to think deeply about how we could help. It will be difficult. As I mentioned before, foreign governments, state governments, are not very well positioned to contribute to democracy promotion. And of course, there's a suspicion about foreign governments as well. Not only do they represent the state and not in this sort of complicated state-society relationship, but states also have multiple and sometimes competing interests. So a government may want to see democracy in Egypt, but may also have concerns about regional security or about development projects or about commercial relations. Governments can't always act in a completely unambiguous manner. And so what can outsiders do? What I'd like to propose, if we want to help the democracy activists of Egypt, is to engage them on their own terms. Let us borrow ourselves from this same social media mindset to think about how we can offer concrete help to Egypt's democracy activists. We can go through the same principles that I identified before to tease out how we might engage. First, to the basis of participation. What if we were to participate not as governments, representatives of the Canadian government in Ottawa or the American government in Washington or what have you, but as peers ourselves? This is a network of individuals. We also are individuals, and there's nothing stopping us from engaging with those networks if Egyptians will have us as well. As long as we do so on the same basis, that basis of equality as peers, on a basis of mutual respect, not coming with any assumption that because we come from Canada or wherever else that we know how democracy is done and therefore are coming to teach. No, just as individuals that share an interest and that are willing to engage on that basis. Secondly, respecting that desire for collective ownership that's intrinsic in the social media mindset in the Egyptian revolution, that this is a task for Egyptians primarily to come up with their own solutions. Perhaps the role for outsiders is to provide tools that could facilitate that collective ownership. I'll be giving an example shortly of a technological tool that we're trying to develop at Stanford University that could help Egyptian activists. It doesn't need to be technological. It could be any kind of skill set that assists citizens in organizing, in mobilizing, in trying to influence elections, in trying to advance human rights, and trying to advance any particular issue. As long as we leave the content generation, the decisions about what kind of institutions Egyptians need, to the Egyptians themselves. And third, I believe it's important for us to act with complete transparency, to document what we're doing, what support we're providing, so that Egyptians themselves can judge whether they welcome this support or not. It should be completely voluntary and completely in response to demand. And of course, in order for them to make those decisions, it needs to be completely in the open, what we're doing. Now, these three principles have something in common with open source software. I don't want to belabor the technological analogies here, but this is kind of something worth thinking about. The way that open source software is developed might offer an interesting analogy for democracy. If you think of democracy as a piece of code, it doesn't belong to any one particular country. It's not America's to sell, just as an open source software doesn't belong to one company to sell to other people. Open source software also has this capacity for being adapted by different users to suit whatever their potential needs are. They're completely free to do so. It's open software, and everything is then documented so that if you want to undo changes or if you want to understand how changes were made, everything is available on the internet. This might be an interesting model for us to pursue in thinking about democracy promotion. It's for that reason that I call this approach an open source approach to democracy promotion. Anyway, that sounds quite theoretical. Let me talk in more practical terms about what it would actually look like. At Stanford University, following the visit that we took to Egypt in March and April, we have been working on a project related to the Constitution. So as I mentioned earlier, Egyptians are facing a parliamentary election in September, and shortly after that, there will be a period of constitutional negotiations to rewrite the rules of the political system in Egypt. There will likely be a relatively small number of people working on this, negotiating a text. It will likely be done in a high degree of politicization and perhaps even polarization. We certainly know in Canada how polarizing constitutional debates can be. They'll be polarizing over different issues, probably over the role of religion in the state, possibly around sectarian divisions. We can expect this to be a very contentious process. If it's something that's managed by politicians and by political parties with specific interests, it's likely to be even more polarized. So one idea that Egyptians shared with us when we were there was the desire to involve many citizens in the process of coming up with the Constitution. Egyptians have taken control of their own destinies with this revolution. They should also be involved in writing the rules of the new system. How would you do that? Well, one way would be through crowdsourcing technology. Crowdsourcing is the mass production of content in the way that Wikipedia is produced. Rather than having a small number of experts write the definitions, you put it to the wisdom of the crowds, and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people participate in this collective drafting exercise. The idea that was shared with us was that perhaps this kind of approach could be brought to the negotiations of the Constitution. Whether or not the official negotiations, at least a parallel discussion in civil society about what constitution should be appropriate for Egypt, with people debating various texts to deal with some of the most contentious issues, voting on this, debating it, trying to understand the various perspectives, perhaps seeing how different constituencies view similar issues in different ways to find new political space for compromise. That would be the appeal of these negotiations. At a bare minimum, it at least would educate Egyptians that are then asked to vote in a referendum, yes or no, in favor of this constitution. But if it was done well and there was enough participation, it could actually influence the official negotiations themselves. So how would we go about implementing this project? Through the same principles that I mentioned before. We are doing this not as representatives of any government, but just as researchers, activists, academics that share this commitment to Egyptian democracy and that are interested in the outcomes of the transition in Egypt. The collective ownership must be Egyptian. The content of negotiating a constitution, we have no business whatsoever in suggesting what the content should be. That should be for the Egyptians. But with the expertise in crowdsourcing in Silicon Valley, there are people there that know how crowdsourcing works and could help adapt the technology for the use by these Egyptian partners. So we could provide the tools for collective ownership. And third, we are documenting everything and being completely transparent about the work that we're doing, the funding that we receive, the partners that we are working with. So last Saturday, After our visit to Egypt was over, we came back with this idea. I organized a hackathon. A hackathon is where people with computer programming skills, euphemistically called hackers, gather on a Saturday or a weekend to do volunteer work, essentially to hack for fun. Hacking here doesn't necessarily mean breaking into private data. It's just a generic term for what computer scientists do. So we put a call out, said, here's the idea. Anyone who's interested in Egyptian politics, please come and see what we can do. We got 80 volunteers. Computer programmers, web designers, translators, constitutional experts, who all came and spent an entire Saturday from 10 in the morning until 8 at night brainstorming about how to build this tool that Egyptian partners could use. And this is actually an image of one of the tools that we started to develop, a prototype of a website that would then be further developed, translated into Arabic, and brought back to Egypt. So this is just one example of an open source democracy promotion project. But you've got to think, if there are 80 volunteers that would come on a sunny May morning to campus to brainstorm technology solutions for Egyptian democracy, if you could scale that up, how many people do you think we could get involved? When there are crises, humanitarian crises like the earthquake in Haiti last year, there were thousands of volunteers all around the world that logged into the internet and contributed to the humanitarian effort campaign. There was an ingenious system whereby any information available on people trapped under the rubble was communicated to a diaspora community of Haitians that could translate those messages into English, and those messages were then communicated to any first responders that could get to whatever site, all geolocated so they knew exactly where to go in Haiti. We've also seen this kind of response when there are elections. So in Kenya, thousands and thousands of people used a program called Ushahidi to identify where they thought election fraud was being committed. If we can tap into that kind of talent pool, that kind of volunteer pool to support Egypt's democracy activists, we could leverage the power of our societies and add to the tools that are already there for states to interact with states, to have society-to-society linkages to help facilitate democracy promotion elsewhere. An open source democracy promotion agenda would have a few advantages. As we've seen with the last example, it offers something tangible and concrete, tools that Egyptians could actually use to help build their own democracy. I believe it's also legitimate because it doesn't involve any state, any government's interference in the politics of another country. It's just interested individuals from around the world that are collaborating to make this happen. And finally, I think it's culture neutral. It doesn't presuppose what democracy should look like in any country because it's up to the people of that country to use the tools as they see fit to come up with institutions that work for their particular country, for their society, for their culture. It would be Egyptians, in this case, that would be making all the decisions. There's a final element that I find quite appealing about it, which is that there's nothing saying that the models coming up, that Egyptians come up with in driving forward their democratic transition could not be replicated elsewhere, even back in our own democracies. If they do figure out a way to crowdsource constitutional negotiations, for example, there's no reason why that could not be imported into a European country, for example, and turn the entire notion of democracy promotion on its head. So instead of this image of the West teaching the rest of the world how to do democracy, we may actually find ourselves in a situation where it's us that have the learning to do and the Egyptians that are doing the teaching. Let me end there and take your questions. Thank you very much. I think we have microphones on that side, and there might be one on this side as well. I can't quite see with the glare. And I believe that anyone who's watching on the web is able to send in a question by chat. Question over there.
Yep, good evening. My name's Alex Hudson. I'm a master's student in political science at the University of Waterloo. And first I'd like to thank you very much for going to Egypt and coming back. As a very junior political scientist, I was a bit dismissive of the role of technology in this process initially, not seeing too much in the literature on protests to kind of support this. But my question is, with this new focus on a network of peers, which I think is really fascinating, do you think we're more likely to see something that might be akin to a tyranny of a majority or a more consociational system? So, I mean, where there's already violence between Christians and Muslims in Egypt, do you think where we have a crowdsourced constitution, there would be protection for minorities, or would it be more of a majority ownership?
Great question. I should point out that I'm a complete novice at tech as well. The only reason I got interested in this is having followed Egyptian democracy issues for a long time. I realized that something fundamentally new was happening, and so I've been trying to bone up as quickly as possible on technology. But it's primarily driven by my interest in politics. You raise a very good question. Like any tool, and particularly any tool that allows many people to collaborate together, that can be used for either good or for bad purposes. And there's nothing stopping mass collaboration tools from being used to develop some kind of majority, tyranny of the majority, as you mentioned, or some kind of mob mentality. I think it's up to the people involved, the Egyptians involved, to make sure that those tools are being used for good. And any suggestions that we can make and how to do that would be helpful. So I think the way to break down some of the divisions between sectarian groups would be to try and promote collaboration across sectarian lines. There were also incentives in a political system that can either exacerbate or alleviate tensions between the two. So, for example, perhaps negotiating a constitutional text, there might be particular emphasis placed on various kinds of constitutional design that might exacerbate. You mentioned consociationalism, which, if I understand correctly, is when communities, ethnic groups are formally organized so that they are represented as members of their ethnic group in a society. That may have worked in some countries, but it may also be quite divisive in others. So one contribution outsiders could make would be just to provide information on when that kind of dynamic has worked and when it has been divisive and should potentially be put aside. But the decision would have to be left to the people of the country themselves.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Rob Sloan. I teach in the School of Business at Conestoga College here in Kitchener. And I'm getting used to the social media. The kids in my classes all the time are kind of below the desk and they're busy working their Blackberries, so often I have very negative associations with social media. But I was wondering, back to the origins of all of this, you talked about transparency and you talked about how all of this information is being shared. And I remember a month before the Egyptian revolution, WikiLeaks issued a whole lot of information about the governments of Yemen and Egypt and various North African and Middle East governments. And there was a lot of real concern. I remember watching on CNN, and Hillary Clinton was so upset, and diplomats around the world were very concerned about WikiLeaks. It started showing up on all the social media. And I mean, this was transparency to the nth degree. I want you to just comment on how important was WikiLeaks, in your opinion, in terms of being a catalyst for these movements?
Well, one thing I will say about transparency is that there are valid reasons why governments can't always be transparent about everything that we do. Just like in business, you can't be completely transparent about everything you do. There are certain things that need to be kept confidential. I believe that WikiLeaks played a greater role in the Tunisian revolution than in Egypt. I've certainly heard a lot more about the reports of corruption of the Ben Ali regime that were caught in American diplomatic cables. I wasn't exposed to many similar stories in Egypt, but certainly affected things in Tunisia. I think one of the advantages of going with this more society-based approach of open source democracy promotion is that you can afford to be completely transparent in a way that governments might not be, and therefore avoid some of the challenges that come up with WikiLeaks. Yes.
Hi, my name is Pete Peters, and I have two questions. The first is, do you feel there's any real danger in Egypt that the democracy movement could be hijacked by some other extremist groups in the region? And then two, what do you feel the surrounding countries around Egypt are feeling, notably Israel, about this movement?
There are certainly concerns by Egyptian democracy activists that their revolution will be hijacked by any number of political forces. I suppose it's important to clarify what we might have in mind by being hijacked. Certainly, if there was a party that were to win power and then cancel elections, kind of like the Nazis in 1933 in Germany, that would definitely be hijacking. So there should be some kind of commitment to maintaining an open political system as a rule for participation. Sometimes hijacking, though, just means that perhaps a party that I don't agree with might win the elections, which gets you to the majority rules question from earlier on. We cannot predict what party will win the elections and what the ideological complexion would be. I also believe that it's not really our place as outsiders to cast judgment on any particular party, as long as the parties are committed to retaining an open political system so that the citizens themselves continue to have the rights to choose. And that would include most of the political parties in Egypt. There will be some more extremist parties, and that will be a challenge that Egyptians will have to come with. I may be more optimistic than this on other people, but knowing the Egyptians that I know, I find a real commitment to moderation. And in spite of the sectarian divisions, I also see a very strong commitment to national unity and to positive and productive relations across the Muslims and the Christians. There are certainly risks when you go down the democratic path, but I guess I just have faith that most Egyptians are moderate and reasonable, and that ultimately, if they're allowed to choose their government, there will be one that will show a degree of tolerance. Now, you also ask about the impact on the region. I can't claim any expertise on Israel itself per se. I've never lived there. I've never been based there. What I can say about the broader Arab world, and in fact, the developing world more generally, is that Egypt has always been a beacon, a model where political experiments in Egypt get replicated elsewhere. We saw this with the rise of Arab nationalism with Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 1950s, who set a model for political leadership elsewhere in the Arab world and even across the other developing countries. And I think we saw this also with fundamentalist Islam, with the early roots of the Muslim Brotherhood, and some of the extremism of Sayyid Qutb in the 1960s also replicated elsewhere. So there is this sense that Egypt is a laboratory for political innovations that then get replicated elsewhere, whether they're innovations that we would consider positive or negative. And that's another reason why it's so important. What's at stake in Egypt is not just the system that Egyptians will inherit, but there is that chance that what happens in Egypt will catch on elsewhere.
I'm Asif Farouk. I'm a graduate student at the University of Waterloo. My question is, well, first of all, it's fascinating that how internet has been using for the next phase of democracy promotion, which is the constitution building, by having it as an open source. Now, as all the states are more adapted, for instance, the authoritarian states, from Myanmar to China to Kazakhstan, there are more and more clamping on this virtual network so that the activists in those countries don't get to make a successful movement. So in that case, do you think that virtual networking will lose its impetus or the power of bringing together all this group for a movement like in Tunisia or Egypt, like in terms of making a difference between promotion as of initiating, when a society says that we don't want this government anymore, we want a change, to a difference to making next phase, which is constitution building or government state building in that case.
Well, it's certainly true that that technology and social media can be used just not only by democracy activists, but can also be used by regimes to make their repression more effective. And we've seen that in many countries, including in Iran. I think the conclusion to draw is that regardless of the impact that technology is going to have, positive or negative, it is inescapable fact of political organization now, certainly in the Middle East and more generally. There will be limits on what we can do to limit the use, to constrain repressive regimes from using internet, to restrict the rights of their governments. I think that would be further reason for why it would be appropriate for citizens of countries like Canada or elsewhere to make their own contributions to helping people in these countries use the technology to advance democracy or human rights. That perhaps volunteers of internet activists, digital activists in Canada and elsewhere can make their own contributions just to tip the balances so that these new technologies are being used on balance to give individual citizens more rights rather than less rights. Not really sure how that translates into different phases of political movements, because I think ultimately that would be up to the activists of those countries themselves to determine what their political strategies are. But I do think it's all the more reason why we should be helping as individuals to make sure that this technology is used for good.
Thank you.
My name is Dr. Muhammad Al-Masri. I'm a professor of computer engineering at the University of Waterloo. So I come from the technology side, and also I'm a political activist both in Canada and Egypt. Thanks, Ben, for an interesting presentation, and I have two comments. The first one is related to economical development. You really touched base on the political side and how the technology can help. But young professional Egyptians who've been involved in the revolution, right now they are switching to a different mode because they know democracy does not provide bread on the table. And they are rightly so. So they are using the same technologies that you did outline in order to get a network to do business plan for startup, etc., and seeking help from high-tech technology companies, which we have dozens of them in the Waterloo region, and I did contact some of them. For example, already Google donated $250,000 for a prize for the best business plan, which can come up in 6 months. Yes, they have a special interest that it is related to the technologies that you did outline, but still, it's a good start. So I'm hoping that somebody from REM is actually listening, especially
appeal to their competitive spirit.
Especially my ex-student is a CEO. I'm not sure if Mike is here, but I'm sure that he will hear about this. The second comment is actually the impact on the region. I've been in Tahrir Square myself, and I visited Egypt for 3 weeks after that when I met you in Cairo. And I tell you this, that the Egyptian revolution is unique in history, and Arab revolution are all unique in history, and the most bloodiest revolution among the Arab revolution is less bloody than the French Revolution. And also, remember, any of these revolutions are only 100 days old. You know, so it's very, very, very young. But I think the impact, you can feel it in the region, that people right now hold the soft power. And regarding the question about Israel, my prediction, and mark my words for it, there will be a revolution in Israel by young Israeli Jewish people against Zionism, where they're spending 15% of their adulthood under arms, fighting Palestinians, civilians, killing them, torturing them, etc. So you will see non-Zionist Israel in the very, very near future. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I did come across evidence of a very vibrant tech sector in Egypt when I was there. There's an industrial zone on the outskirts of the city called Smart Village, where they have some of the best tech firms in the world innovating and developing new technologies. And so our project is based in Silicon Valley, and that's why we have some American technologists involved. But there is this tremendous talent available in Egypt as well, and we hope to tap into that as we go forward.
My name is David Lord. I'm with an organization called Peace Build, which is a group of Canadian NGOs that work on peace and conflict issues. And I have two questions, Ben. One has to do with the representation that you can get through this kind of technology. If you have 2 million out of 80 million Egyptians who have access to the technology and so on, and in a process like trying to influence the content of a constitution, how do you get into the representation issues? And the other thing is something of a follow-up on what Dr. El-Nasri was mentioning, and that's how do you perhaps look at other very pressing issues aside from constitutional reform, jobs in Egypt, the remnants of the security apparatus that was the force abusing ordinary Egyptians, and what becomes of that, and how are those abuses banned for the future and monitored, security services and that sort of thing. So the economy, youth employment, security services, are there other killer apps, that might be usable to open up discussion and thinking about how to deal with these pressing issues as well?
Yeah, those very, very good points, both. There is this digital divide in Egypt between the 12 million that have access to the internet and the, I think it's 81 million altogether, so what does that leave, 69 or 79 million. The name that we gave our project, as you can see here on the website at the bottom left, was Cloud to Street, and the idea was to see if there's tools that would specifically help groups that organize themselves in the cloud and the internet with some of the incredible skill that we've seen that they can pull together in cyberspace, to see if they can translate that from the cloud to the street, so into political processes. And that involves reaching beyond the bubble of Egyptians that are in the internet. So to give two examples with this constitutional project that I mentioned, one idea that came to us was that, or that Egyptians themselves suggested to us, is that if you have this online debate and discussion, perhaps every week or every 2 weeks, you could publish the results of where that debate has gone, and then publish it in newspapers or broadcast it over the radio to reach a much wider audience. And then you can even make it interactive through the use of cell phones, which are much more diffuse in Egypt. I think cell phone distribution is close to 50% of the population, where people could read the newspapers or listen to the radio and then vote in by SMS. That's just one way to do it. Another tactic that we've been considering is with public opinion polling, to at least give data on Egyptian citizen preferences beyond the educated classes based in Cairo, which tend to be the bulk of the internet population. So what do Egyptians outside of Cairo, in the rural areas and in lower levels of the socioeconomic strata, to make sure that their opinions are being fed into the process as well. In terms of the selection of projects or causes to which outside support might be loaned, I guess the advantage or disadvantage, depending on your perspective, of a private initiative, a society-driven initiative, is that you wouldn't necessarily have a top-down plan of what all of the various needs are that need to be addressed. It's more of a bottom-up self-organizing process where activists in Egypt that are able to reach out and seek outside help, and activists outside in the rest of the world who respond to that call will have to make a series of bilateral connections amongst themselves. We were focused on democracy issues, on political issues, but we did come across quite a few other groups. So the hope is that that the needs would find people to address them. We certainly came across quite a few groups that were looking into entrepreneurship and job creation. We came across quite a few NGOs that were looking into social issues. There's a very strong campaign for workers' rights and for the minimum wage in Egypt, and there were other technology solutions being offered to those causes as well. So there's nothing about this that would necessarily be restricted to political activism per se, just because that was our particular focus. Get any chat questions?
Thank you. I don't believe there are any questions. So I'll just, well, I want to say thank you, Ben, as people around me said as soon as you concluded your formal remarks. Wow, that was great. It really was great. And I'm very grateful to you for all of your comments tonight, to Canadian Political Science Association for having their conference here that brought you here, and to Mark Sedger and his team for facilitating your appearance here tonight. So thanks to everyone. I certainly gained a lot from that. It was interesting to hear not just how technology is helping foster this revolution in Egypt, but the underlying values, the mindset of open source democracy, the peer-to-peer and the crowdsourcing and the transparency that are activating these democratic activities, and also how that can be prescriptive for constructive engagement by outsiders too. So very interesting and refreshing insights. And I was also inspired by your, I guess you used the word faith, that these democratic movements can result not in a tyranny of the majority, but in positive good for all the people of Egypt. So I'm inspired by that. So thank you very much. An excellent presentation. Just a few very brief notes for our audience before we adjourn tonight. The video from tonight's live webcast will be edited and posted to CIGI's website in our online video archive for anyone who missed it. And if you wish to sign up for CIGI's regular newsletter sent by email and called CIGI Worldwide, our volunteers are available here to help you with that. I want to thank our public event sponsors again, 570 News and Wordsworth Books, for making nights like this possible. And finally, please mark your calendar for our last two public events of the season. On Tuesday, May 31st, our topic is Groupthink and Overconfidence, Predictive Failures in the Global Economic Crisis. Our special guest is Ruben Lamdany of the IMF, a very topical organization these days. And he recently wrote a report criticizing his own organization's role in the financial crisis. Joining him in a discussion will be U of T professor and economist Lou Pawley, as well as CIGI Distinguished Fellow Paul Jenkins acting as moderator. And then finally, on June 21st, join us for our annual media panel co-sponsored by the Canadian International Council. Our topic is Muzzled Media, the Global Challenge. We have 5 excellent journalists, all of whom are Canadians, who have covered stories internationally, and they'll be talking about the risks and dangers to foreign correspondents in war zones, even the risks of jail, torture, and murder. All of these events are detailed on the CIGI website. You can register there to attend. It's free. And thank you once again for coming to CIGI tonight. Please have a safe journey home. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say. And my name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at CIGI. Tonight is the latest in our regular series of public events, the CIGI Signature Lecture Series. I'd like to thank CIGI's public event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books. Thank you for your continuing support. Besides the audience here tonight at the CIGI Atrium, we also have a global audience who are watching through our live webcast available anywhere that has the internet. Following tonight's address, we welcome questions from the audience, either at the microphones here at CIGI or if you're watching online, you can ask questions through the live chat function on your screen, and we'll transmit those questions to our speaker. As well, CPAC is covering tonight's event. CPAC is the cable public affairs channel. Our topic tonight is politics and peace building, testing a new approach in Egypt. Our guest speaker is Ben Roswell, who will be introduced more properly in just a moment by CIGI Senior Fellow Mark Sedra. Mark is the leader of CIGI's project on security sector governance and also teaches in the Department of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. Mark's current research focuses on the topic of post-conflict state building with an emphasis on security issues. He's conducted research on a number of countries and regions, including Northern Ireland, Sudan, Afghanistan, the Balkans, and the Middle East, tonight's topic. So Mark, over to you.
Good evening. I'm going to keep this relatively brief so we can get straight to Ben and have plenty of time for questions afterwards. This is, as I'm sure you'll all agree, is an historic and defining period for the Arab world, and particularly for Egypt. Egypt is the beating heart of the Arab world, and the changes that Egypt is undergoing right now, and we're still in the early stages of its revolution, are quite astounding. And the reality is that no one could have predicted or has predicted what has happened in Tahrir Square. One of the most surprising and intriguing parts of this revolution is the role of social media in facilitating the uprising. It has caused many to think deeply about the role of technology, the internet, and social media in democracy promotion and peace building. One of those people who is thinking deeply about this subject is Ben Roswell, who's with us tonight. He is in the right place to do this thinking right now, as he's currently a visiting scholar at Stanford in the heart of Silicon Valley. And he has spent quite a bit of time not only thinking about Egypt and the ongoing Arab Spring, but also about the implications for technology and the role that technology has played. He put a book project on hold, I understand, to probably the detriment of the book overall, and probably his publisher are not happy, to inquire about this important issue when the first signs of revolution began to emerge in Egypt. And he quickly went to Egypt in the aftermath of the revolution to examine what exactly had happened there. This was, as some have called it, Revolution 2.0, a new type of revolution that has to be understood. He's also begun a project to mobilize Silicon Valley professionals to assist Egyptian democracy activists. Ben will be describing his work, this fascinating work, and its initial findings tonight. But before I ask him to come up on stage, maybe I'll just tell you a little bit more about him. Ben Roswell, is currently a visiting scholar at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. He is a Canadian diplomat on leave with a specialization in state building and stabilization. As representative of Canada in Kandahar from 2009 to 10, he directed the Kandahar Provincial Reconstruction Team, leading a team of more than 100 American and Canadian diplomats and workers, civilian police, and other experts in strengthening the provincial government at the heart of the Afghan conflict. Before that, he served as the deputy head of mission for...
In some sense, a response to an international security agenda established in large part by this one violent ideologue. And when you think about it, it's really quite extraordinary that one man with such violent extreme views, not shared by the vast majority of Muslims around the world, could have such a profound impact. How was he able to really shape the entire agenda of international security for at least a decade? And I think the answer lies in the deep wellspring of anger that had risen in countries with dysfunctional domestic politics. For decades, Globalization has brought wrenching changes that has driven social and economic upheavals in countries around the world. In the countries that Osama bin Laden was targeting in particular, the Arab world, very few of those governments had a popular mandate, and that made them less resilient in the face of change. Without that relatively universal source of legitimacy, some of those countries were not able to respond to the demands for change through the peaceful political mechanisms. And so some of the forces for change turned to violence. Violence against their regimes, but violence also against the international system that some held to account for these wrenching changes. Now, I'm not saying any of this to absolve any foreign policy errors by governments that uphold the international system, governments like Canada or the United States, but just to point out that for at least a decade, if not more, the principal challenges that we're facing in international security arise from dysfunctional domestic politics in countries beyond our borders. As the world shrinks, as globalization brings us closer and closer, increased
Canada in Kabul for a year as well. And he's had a number of other postings over the years, including in Iraq, Egypt, Somalia, and others. He is one of our brightest and most distinguished diplomats and an excellent researcher as well. And I should mention that he is here tonight as a disclaimer. He will be speaking as a researcher and will not be representing the Canadian government or speaking on behalf of the Canadian government. So it's with great pleasure that I can ask Ben to come to the stage and welcome him here to CIGI to give this talk.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Mark. It's great to be here at CIGI today. We had some very serious, somber discussions in the morning about Afghanistan, about Haiti. Discussions about peace building do tend towards the more severe. I plan tonight to offer a note of hope on a different country case in Egypt, which I think will be equally important for the future of international security. Now, Mark did mention that I am not speaking as a Canadian government official. I'm on leave right now. I will be drawing on some of my experience as a practitioner who has specialized in international security and governance over at least the last 10 years. Like a lot of people in my profession, the death recently of Osama bin Laden caused me to take a big step back and to think about some of the work that I've done over the last 10 years. It occurred to me that virtually every job that I've done over the last 10 years has been